Good morning,
Okay,
everybody.
good morning. We continue.
Robert.
Morning.
Morning. Okay, we continue on 3b, and we're still doing the same pattern as we did in the last 2 days, which is, namely, we have this dispute between Rabbi Yishomel and Rabbi Akiva, ongoing dispute about three different statements in the Torah as to whether they are voluntary or obligatory. So we went through yesterday and the day before the Sotah and the Kohen becoming impure, where Rabbi Akiva is of the view that when the Torah says you should warn your wife, it's actually an obligation. And we went through the verses yesterday to demonstrate how there's a double expression. The Torah says twice you should warn your wife. And that for the first time is an exemption against the prohibition that ordinarily Torah says don't get involved in strife, don't get involved in causing rift between people. And therefore one might have thought that I shouldn't get involved in some issue my wife is dealing with, lest it cause strife. So if the first time the Torah says to warn your wife, it's an exemption that you may. And then when the Torah repeats itself, when the Torah repeats the warning again, that's an obligation. You shall go ahead and warn her. That's Rabbi Akiva's position. And Rabbi Yishmael's position is no. The entirety is an exemption, which means you only may warn your wife, but you don't have to warn your wife. And as to the fact that the Torah repeats itself, the Torah is repeating itself only for one other detailed law, namely that even though we don't know what happened behind closed doors, she is still forbidden to be with her husband. And because the Torah wants to make that point, the Torah repeats the entirety of the scenario that he warned her. But the warning itself is not to be taken as an important repetition to inform something as if now you have to go and warn her. That was with regard to the Sotah. And the same thing is true with the law of the Kohen getting impure. The Torah says that the Kohen should not become impure. And then the Torah goes on to say, with the exception of your family. And then at the end of listing the family members, it says, for her, you shall get impure. So Rabbi Akiva says that repetition, after giving the exemption and then the Torah repeating itself and saying, for her, you should get impure, this is a commandment. Go to the funeral. The Kohen must go to the funeral. Whereas Rabbi Yishomel says, no, that repetition is not there to tell you that you have to go to the funeral. That repetition is only to teach you a specific law. That this exemption, allowing the Kohen to become impure for his family, is only that he may go to a funeral, but he may not become impure if, God forbid, there's a severed limb in the family. This is what we covered yesterday and the day before. And today, we're going to do a similar thing with the third and final area in which Rabbi Yishomel and Rabbi Akiva have the same dispute as to whether the Torah is saying an exemption, or meaning to say the Torah is giving permission that one may, or is the Torah actually commanding thou shall, you should. So let's do the verses first, and then go to the Gemara so we have the picture. So where are we? 1 second. This verse is Dvarim Chaf Tezvav. So we're Dvarim. That is Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 26. To verse 15 and 16. So the Torah is describing what's going to happen when the Jews enter the land of Israel. Right? The chapter opens up, when you go to war against your enemies. And it talks about the laws of conquering other nations, specifically those that are in the territory that Hashem promised the Jewish people. And the Torah goes on to say how you're going to go to war. So you have the Kohen go there, and the Kohen gives a speech to the people, to the warriors, and then it goes on to say, when you come when you approach the city to wage war against it, first of all, you should propose peace. And then if they respond to you with peace, beautiful, that's great. And if not, then you should go again. If they don't want to make peace, then you go to war. And then God promises that you'll be successful in the war. And then the Torah says, here, you shall strike all of its males with the edge of the sword. I mean, those are the people that you're allowed to kill in battle. However, women and children and livestock you may not. And then it says, this is what you shall do for all the cities which are not the cities of these nations. Meaning to say, that's what you do when you're going to conquer lands that are outside of the territory promised to us by God in the land of Israel. But then here's what you're going to do in those lands. However, of these people's cities, which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, that is to say, the cities that are in the land of Israel proper, right? The laws described in the previous chapters, the previous verses I just described, is for other cities that you're going to encounter in battle for whatever reason. Now we're talking about, Hashem is talking about the land, the cities that are in the land of Eretz Yisrael proper. So of this, you shall not allow any soul to live. So that would imply that there should be no survivors if they don't accept terms of peace. Rather, you shall utterly destroy them. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jesuits, and the Lord your God has commanded you. That is, these are the nations that are living in the land of Israel proper. So, and the reason why is so that they shall not teach you to act in according to the abominations that they have done for their gods, whereby you would sin against the Lord your God. In other words, you're living amongst these people. They're going to be a terrible influence. Get rid of them. Okay. So this is the context, right? So the same way the previous two laws, the law of the Sotah, had the context in that the Torah says don't cause strife, and therefore you require exemption, saying that you may interfere with your wife, and then a commandment, even in Rabbi Akiva's view. Same thing with the kohen. The context is Hashem says the kohen may not become impure. Comes along the verse and says for your family you may, and then it goes on to say maybe even an obligation. So same thing true over here. The first thing the Torah says is you may not let the people live. That is the people that live in the land of Israel proper. But now we get an exemption. So let's go to Vayikra. This is Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 25, verse 45 and 46. Again, if I'm not being clear, please interrupt me. Okay, it says like this. So first it talks about a Jewish slave servant that you might have. And it goes on to go to the details, talking about how you can't sell them as slaves because they're God's slaves. And then it says you shall not work them with rigor, and you shall fear God, and you don't overburden your slave. And then same thing, your male slave and your female slave, whom you have from the nations. Now this is non-Jewish slaves that are around you. From them you may acquire a male slave or female slave. So you can't buy a Jewish slave. There are some ways in which a Jewish slave might become a slave, but you're supposed to minimize in that activity. But the non-Jewish slaves that you could buy, if you want to buy a non-Jewish slave, go ahead. Now this is talking about nations of the world that are outside of Israel. Now comes the next verse. And also from the children of the residents that live amongst you. So now we're talking about slaves that are in Israel. Non-Jews that are in Israel. From them you may acquire slaves, and from their family that is with you, whom you begot in your land, they shall become your inheritance. And then it goes on. You shall hold on to them as an inheritance for your children after you, as acquired property, and may thus have them serve you forever. But as for your brethren, the children of Israel, a man shall not work with his brother with rigor. Don't overburden your Jewish slaves. Okay, so here's the repetition. So first of all, here's the exemption. Torah before said, that we read before in Devarim, you have to get rid of all the people that live in the land of Israel. But now here it says you could take slaves. So there's an exemption. Here's people you're allowed to let live if you're going to take them as slaves. That's number one. But then
isn't that, Levi, isn't that only if they don't, you can take the slaves only if they're, if they make peace with you.
No, it seems, okay, that's a good question. But it seems like even if they don't. Right, because otherwise it's not the exemption, right? Because you're allowed to let people live if they make peace, right? So let's see, maybe this is, good point. I haven't thought of that. Let's look at the Rashi, see if there's any help here. Good point. Right, so here, look, first, in the verse here where it says that your male slaves and female slaves whom you have from the nations that are around you. So it says Rashi that are around you, but not those that are within the borders of the land of Israel. For indeed, regarding them, I said, you shall not allow them to live. That's the verse read before in Deuteronomy. So you're not allowed to let them live. But there's an exemption. As we're going to see in a minute, there's an exemption for that. Okay, he doesn't make the distinction, so I don't know the answer to that question. It's a good point. But it would seem here, even if they don't make peace, you're allowed to take them as slaves, even if you don't make peace. That's what it seems like. Let's just go with that for a moment. A good question. Okay, so let's look at the repetition here. So first of all, we already have the exemption. Torah in Deuteronomy said you have to get rid of all the slaves. You have to get rid of all the people in the land. And here the Torah gives an exemption saying that you can take slaves from your land. Exactly what the exemption is, the Gemara will explain. But let's see the repetition. Here it says, one time it says here, and also from the children of the residents of the slave, and also from the children of the residents that are live amongst you, from them you may acquire slaves. So right there, there's an exemption. And then here's repeated. You shall hold as them inheritance for your children after you, as acquired property, may thus have them serve you forever. Repetition. Exemption already given here in 45, repetition in 46. So you can already see where this is going. Rabbi Akiva is going to say that this repetition is to tell you it's an obligation, that you have to keep your non-Jewish slave, and you may not let him free. Whereas Rabbi Yishomel is going to say, no, the repetition is only to teach you a specific law. This is where we're going. So you already see the same pattern. So now let's look at the Gemara. Now there are some details that I did not mention because there are specific kind of slaves from the non-Jewish slave that you're allowed to keep in the land of Israel. And that's going to come up now. But even as we get to those details, remember this overall pattern, that there's a repetition in the exemption. Right? Torah says get rid of the people, but then there's an exemption for slaves. That exemption is repeated. So once for exemption, you may take slaves. And then the second one in Rabbi Akiva is obligation. And Rabbi Yishomel, it is to teach you one specific law. Keep that in mind even as we learn other details. So let's see. So we're over here. This is 3b, right? Yeah, 3b. Right over here. So Torah says, you shall keep these slaves forever. That was the second verse we read before. So Rishos, this is a exemption. It's voluntary. If you want to keep the non-Jewish slave forever, you may. Of course, Rabbi Yishomel, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yishomel. Rabbi Akiva says, it's an obligation. You should keep them. You're not allowed to let them free. So we already know where Rabbi Akiva's position is, even though the Gemara is going to tell it to us later. But we already understand Rabbi Akiva's position, given the pattern before, because this injunction, where the Torah says, you shall keep the slave forever, is repeated. It already said before that you may take slaves, and now it says you should keep them forever. Therefore, it's an obligation, meaning to say that you're not allowed to free those slaves. Okay, so first let's see Rabbi Yishomel. How does Rabbi Yishomel justify the repetition without saying that it's an obligation? Want to say that? I have little Chaim joining us for Gemara today. Okay, so how does Rabbi Yishomel justify the repetition without turning it into an obligation? So my time at the Rabbi Yishomel, what's the reason for Rabbi Yishomel? So I did considering that the verse read in Deuteronomy, you may not let any of the people who live in the land of Israel live. You have to completely obliterate those people. That was the premise. That was the premise that we started with. The context is that you may not allow the locals of Israel to live. That was the verse in Deuteronomy, the first verse we read. So the Torah then has to come give you an exemption that you may keep slaves. To allow what specifically? Here's what it allows specifically. And this is the detail I was saying that we didn't mention, but it's going to come here and here now. There's a specific type of slave the Torah is giving an exemption to, namely, anyone from the other nations that are not from the land of Israel, which then marries a local non-Jewish girl from the land of Israel, and they have a child. So what is the halachic status of this child? The father comes from the nations of the world from which you're allowed to take slaves. The mother comes from the local, from Israel, where you're not allowed to let them live. So which one? How do we define this child? By the father or by the mother? The father coming from outside of Israel, where there's no exemption even needed, because it comes from the world around you, doesn't come from the land of Israel. Or do you follow the mother, where she is from Israel? So says the Gemara, says You're allowed to buy this person as a slave because non-Jews follow the father. Whereas in Jewish lineage, we follow the mother, right? You're Jewish if your mother's Jewish. But even in Judaism, your tribe follows your father. So the same thing is true of a non-Jewish person. Maybe the fact that they're non-Jewish comes from the mother, but which tribe comes from the father? Right? So the father comes from outside of Israel, therefore you can buy the slave. Okay, the Tanya, for we've learned, if it's not clear, please again interrupt me. Tanya, for we've learned. This is going to be a Mishnaic H text that indicates this same idea. How do we know that anyone that comes from the nations outside of Israel, which was intimate, which married a local non-Jewish girl, and our son is born to them. So the mother is from the land of Israel, the father is from outside the land of Israel. We don't know the determination of the son. So how do we know that you're allowed to buy them as a slave, following the determination of its father, because his father comes from outside of Israel? So Talmud Sotah comes the verse and says, from amongst the nations that dwell with you, from them you can buy as a slave. So here we see, where does the exemption go? Let's look at the verse specifically. Here. And also from the children of the residents that live amongst you. Child of the resident. Who's that? So the resident himself maybe wasn't born in Israel, but he lives amongst you. Now this person's child, you could, because the resident, the father, came from outside of Israel. So there's your exemption. That because the father came from outside of Israel, even though this person is born in Israel, you can buy the slave. So there's your exemption. So Yachol. So then maybe Af Knani Shaba al Achas min Ummais V'El Ben Shatarol. Maybe the reverse. Maybe reverse. Maybe. So in this first scenario, we have a non-Jewish father coming from outside of Israel, marrying a mother who lives in Israel. And we're told you're allowed to buy the child as a slave because it goes to the father, even though this person is born in Israel. Nonetheless, it gets the exemption because his father came from outside of Israel. Maybe the reverse. Let's see the reverse. You have the father is from Israel, the mother is from outside of Israel, and now they have a child. So maybe too, we can follow the mother and say, oh, this child came from a mother who's from outside of Israel, I get the exemption. Talmud Sotah comes the verse and says, Asher lidu ba'artzachem, those who were born in your land, minanol ba'artzachem, v'loi minagarden ba'artzachem. So like this. Let's get the verse again. So the verse reads like this, and also from the children of the residents that live amongst you. So the resident that lives amongst you is the father. This guy came from out of town, outside of Israel, and now he lives amongst us. He has a child, you can take the slave. From them you may acquire slaves, and from their family, and now here's the other thing, from the family whom they begot in your land. So this is the key words here. Whom they begot in your land. Meaning to say, there's someone who came from outside and begot a child in our land, but not someone from here who begot a child elsewhere. Following? The exemption is only for someone who came from somewhere else and begot a child in our land. A father that came from outside of Israel and has a child in Israel, as opposed to a father from in Israel who now has a child from a mother that's outside of Israel. Specifically, they begot in your land, but not a father from here who begot from somewhere else. Okay, I hope that's clear. It's a little bit confusing. I hope it's clear. So Talmud Sotah comes the verse and says, Asher lidu ba'artzachem, that only those that are born in your land, minanol ba'artzachem, those who are born in your land, from fathers that came outside of the land, those you're allowed to take as slave. But not children of those whose father to begin with lived in your land. Okay. All to say that Rabbi Yishomel looks at this verse and sees exemptions and permissibilities. Not that you have to, but exemptions. Even though the Torah says you're not allowed to let any of the locals live, comes the Torah and gives you an exemption that when there's a father who comes from out of the land and gives birth to a child in the land of Israel, so even though this child was born here in the land of Israel, nonetheless, he gets the status of his father, and that you're allowed to acquire this person as a slave. Rabbi Akiva, after this year, okay? But Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi, we have the repetition, and in Rabbi Yishommel's view, the repetition is there to teach you an exemption, and then the repetition is for a specific law, specific exemption, right? Or there's an exemption. I'm sorry. So let's see the repetition soon. But Rabbi Akiva, he has to deal with this repetition and say that there's no obligation in the repetition. There's only exemption in the repetition. Okay? So where does he derive this from? You shall buy from them. So let's look at the verse again. I'm going back and forth. I hope this is clear. The verse reads, and also from the children of the residents that you live amongst you, from them you may acquire slaves. Stop there. Right. Why go on and say, and from their families with you, whom they begot in your land? We already know that from here. Answer, to tell you, the reason why it's repeated is to tell you there's an obligation.
Lord,
right? Because this here itself, you may acquire them as a slave, is already enough to tell you that the children of residents that lived amongst you. So the resident came from out of town, came here, had a child. You may acquire them as slaves. Enough. Why repeated? For obligation. Okay. And therefore, why then would the verse go on to say in the next verse in 46 that you shall keep them as slaves? You may thus have them as slaves forever. That is, I'm going back and forth. I hope it's clear. If it's not, please stop me. L'chayva as an obligation. So let's see it again. In Rabbi Akiva's view, you have, on the one hand, you have the Torah itself already tells you the exemption in the first verse. And the second verse comes along and says obligatory. Whereas Rabbi Yishommel's view, the first verse, which is repeated, is to tell you a specific law about a child who's born to a father that came from outside the land of Israel. And therefore, in the repetition, there's no implication of obligation. That's the essence of it. So now the question becomes...
I just have a small question.
Yeah.
Is it Rabbi Shmuel's position that there's a new halacha that's supposed to be derived?
Yeah, so right now we're talking about two verses.
Not just that it's not obligatory, but some new halacha.
Right, so there's actually like really three times, because there's this part. You shall hold, there's this, and also the children that are residents live amongst you. From them you shall acquire as slaves. That's one, right? That teaches you that someone who came from out of town who had a child here you can keep. And then there is the repetition here, and from their family that is with you, that they begot in your land, and they shall become your inheritance. According to Rabbi Yishomel, that's teaching you that if the father is local and the mother's from out of town, that's the person you cannot take as a slave. I'm sorry, reverse. That the father's from in town and the mother's from out of town, that's the person you're not allowed to take a slave. But then there's a third time here, and may thus serve for you forever. So now this has to be justified according to Rabbi Yishomel. What's the new law added here? Following? Yeah, right. So we had, because this part itself is repeated, right? So in Rabbi Yishommel's view, this part was repeated to tell you specifically what type of to tell you that you follow the father. You follow the father both if the father came from out of the land of Israel, and therefore you're allowed to take the kid as a slave, and also comes to tell you that the father's from inside the land of Israel. Even if the mother's from outside, you may not take him as a slave. But now there's another repetition, which is here, and thus he may serve you forever. So in Rabbi Akiva, that tells you an obligation, because you already have this law here. Whereas Rabbi Yishomel, what does it teach you? Let's see the new law here. So Rabbi Yishomel, where are we? Here, Rabbi Yishomel, Bahem. What is that the third part, the last repetition of verse 46, where it says, "You shall serve them, you shall make them in servitude forever." That teaches you not that there's an obligation, but behem v'le b'achechem. that they are the ones you're allowed to keep as slaves, but not your brethren, not Jewish slaves. Those are the people you can't keep forever. Or those are the people you can't take as slaves at all. Or let's just say not forever. Let's just keep it simple. So the reason why the Torah repeats itself and says you can keep them forever, says Rabbi Yishomel, is for a specific law. Not to tell you that you're obliged to keep the non-Jewish slave forever, but only to tell you that this exemption to keep your slave forever is only for a non-Jewish slave, not for a Jewish slave. Okay, so that's a good point. Rabbi Akiva now has to justify, where does he know that your brethren are not allowed to be kept forever? So he says, for the Kranafka, from the end of the verse. The verse goes on to say that any of your brethren, you shall not treat them too much, you're not to treat them too harshly. So Rabbi Akiva said, implied in this verse, which said that you shall not, or earlier actually said, you shall not treat your brother harshly, implied in that verse is, don't keep them forever.
So there's a different verse that already goes to that law.
Exactly.
So you can't go back and use the other
Exactly.
law. That's Rabbi Shmuel's trying to do, right?
That's right. But Rabbi Shmuel is now going to say the repetition was needed. Rabbi Shmuel because the repetition is only because it's like this. Let's look at this. So, where is it? Okay, so here's repetition for Rabbi Akiva. The repetition again in this thing. Here, and you may thus serve you forever. So it's them that you may serve, right? Just them, meaning not Jewish. But as for your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not work his brother with rigor. Repeated. Them means the exemption is exclusive for the non-Jewish. That's the only one you're allowed to keep forever. And then here it says, don't keep your brother forever. Repeated. Why repeated? Because this is an obligation. You shall keep them forever. Whereas Rabbi Yishomel says, no, this repetition of keeping them forever is only because it's telling you not to harass your brethren, therefore repeats itself and says you should keep them forever. But not because this them is an inherent law. Is that clear?
What happens if it doesn't work out?
What doesn't work out?
You take them on, and they don't work out. They don't do their work properly. They're lazy. They're
in Rabbi Akiva's opinion.
Yeah.
Seems like it's you're not allowed to let them free. Good question. Don't know the answer. But Rabbi Akiva's
shoot them?
like no, I don't. You're not allowed to do that. Good question. I don't know the answer. Okay, I hope it's somewhat clear. Let's look through the verses again after we conclude this. Okay, the Tanya Rabbi Yishomel says, and this is consistent with his view, the founder Rabbi Yishomel learns, call Parsha number of Nishnus, anytime the Torah repeats itself, Nishnus, only repeated, only for one law that's repeated. So let's see again in here how this goes. Let's go with Rabbi Akiva and then Rabbi Yishomel. Rabbi Akiva says, so this verse here, one second. I'm not clear on this Rabbi Akiva here. It's a bit of an issue. Actually, doesn't help us here either. Okay, let's just try it. So this verse here, and also from the children that are residents. So there's the resident, which lives amongst you. So he came from out of town. He's a non-Jew from outside of town. So you're allowed to take as a slave. And he begot a child in town. Him, you're allowed to take as slave. From them, you may acquire as slaves. Okay. So that's telling you that you follow the father. The father came from out of town, from out of Israel. Even though he's born in Israel, you can take him as a slave because the father came from out of Israel. And then it goes on to say, and from their family that is with you, whom they begot in your land. So now this is somebody, and they shall become your inheritance. So now this is coming to tell you that if the mother is from outside of Israel, and the father is from inside of Israel, that's a person you may not take as slave, because the only people you have to take as slave is them who begot in your land. Only if they begot in your land. not someone who's begot outside of your land from a father that's inside your land. So the repetition in Rabbi Yishmael's view is, one is to tell you the actual law. The law that if the father comes from outside, you're not allowed to take the son that's born, even if it's if the father comes from outside, you may take the son as a slave because even though he was born in your land, but because his father came from outside of your land. And then the repetition is to tell you an exclusion, that don't think the same thing would apply if the mother came from out of town. If the mother came from out of town, don't think you're allowed to take the child as a slave because the mother's from out of town. No, it's only if the father's from out of town. That's Rabbi Yishmael's view in this verse. Whereas Rabbi Akiva says, just the first half is enough. You may acquire them. You may acquire from them as your slave. That's enough to say them and no other. Okay. The Gemara leaves open what Rabbi Akiva does with this part, so I'm not 100% clear on that. But this is what the Gemara says. 1 minute shy. Almost finished. Okay, then we have this verse. Rabbi Yishmael says, you should hold on to them as inheritance for your children after you, as acquired property, and may thus have them serve you forever. That's an obligation. Keep them forever, because you already know over here the exemption. Now, as for the fact, that's Rabbi Akiva's view. And as for the fact that you're not allowed to keep your brethren forever, that you get from here. But as for your brethren, the children of Israel, a man shall not work on his brother with rigor. So as for the fact that you can't keep a Jewish slave forever, that comes from the second half of the verse, right there. And then for the first half here, which says, and you may thus serve you forever as an obligation. That's Rabbi Akiva's view. Rabbi Yishmael's view is no. The entirety here is just an exemption. The whole thing is an exemption that you cannot keep the exemption is already said in 45. The entirety of 46 is to tell you that you can't keep your Jewish slave forever. But since it already says you can't keep your Jewish slave forever, it already mentions the first half that you may keep your non-Jewish slaves forever. But the fact that it repeated itself and says you may keep the non-Jewish slave forever is not because it wants to tell you have to, but only to get to the main point that you can't keep your brother forever. That's the extra law that this verse gives you, even though it's repeated from 45. I hope that was somewhat clear. It's a little more complicated even than the first ones, but I hope it was somewhat clear.
Yeah.
Kind of? Okay. Have a wonderful day, a wonderful Shabbos.
Good day. Good Shabbos, everybody.
Special Shabbos this week. It's Yud Shvat, the 10th of Shvat. It's the anniversary of when Rebbe became Rebbe. So I encourage you to send a note to the oil today. It's especially in honor of Shabbos coming up.
Okay.
Have a wonderful day.
Good day.
Good Shabbos.
You too, Levi.
You're on.